a trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome to the show. Hey, I'm glad you found us, however you did. Whether you're listening to us on the radio, catching the podcast, or, I don't know, maybe a friend memorized the show and is reciting it to you. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for checking out a program that strives each and every day to supply you with thoughtful, informative commentary and interviews for people who delight in thinking for themselves. If you're one of those people, I am happy to count myself among your circle of friends, or at least among the people that you're willing to listen to. It seems there are a lot of folks who aren't really willing to question things these days, or maybe they're too scared to question things these days. So I'm going to give you some very potent intellectual ammunition to better understand the world around us. You don't have to believe everything you hear on this program, but it will invite you to think clearly and independently about the world around us, as well as what you and I can do to change things for the better within our circle of influence. Some great sponsors make this program possible on a day-to-day basis. They include sponsors like Sewing and Quilting Center in St. George, Utah, HSLammo.com, the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage, LifesavingFood.com. They've got a great special going on for my listeners. I'll be telling you more about that a little bit later on in the hour, and MonticelloCollege.org, as well as GovernYourIncome.com. So today I thought I would start with one of the most shocking lessons that most of us learn at some point in our life, is that the greatest acts of evil are usually carried out by ordinary people. I know we're supposed to believe, it's some monstrous person. Maybe they have a funny mustache or something, some distinguishing characteristic that the person you're dealing with is pure evil. Yes, I know. The bar has been lowered of late. Currently, any cisgendered white male who believes in God may also fill that role. But typically we think of the people who do evil as, people who are responsible for the deaths of millions of others. But the truth of the matter is that the greatest acts of evil are usually just ordinary folks doing what they think they have to do. Kate Wand has a very enlightening commentary and also a short documentary that you should watch about the line dividing good and evil. And it's a really great reminder that the surest way to limit evil is to choose not to let it enter the world through us. This is what Kate Wand has to say. She says, Hannah Arendt, A-E-R-N-D-T, Arendt, was a Jewish German political philosopher who fled Germany back in 1933 and then Europe in 1941 so she could start a new life in America. After the war, having escaped the fate of millions of other Jewish people in the Holocaust, Hannah Arendt tried to reason through the madness. She was looking for answers, and she traveled to Israel in 1961 so she could attend the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi bureaucrat. Eichmann was convicted and sentenced to hang for his incommensurate crimes against humanity, including his supervision over and direction of every part of the implementation of the final solution. In her report on the trial, Arendt wrote that more than half a dozen psychiatrists had certified Eichmann as normal, quote, more normal at any rate than I am after having examined him, one of them was said to have exclaimed, while another found that his whole psychological outlook, his attitude toward his wife and mother, or his wife and children, his mother and father, brothers, sisters, and friends, was not only normal, but most desirable. Now, they knew, of course, that it would have been very comforting indeed to believe that Eichmann was a monster, says Arendt. The trouble with Eichmann was that precisely there were so many like him, and that those many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. Isn't that crazy? She asks, in this case, Kate Wand asks, what if the greatest acts of evil are committed by ordinary people? Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes the following memory in the Gulag Archipelago. A high-ranking soldier, he's arrested by the Soviets while still in uniform, following victory against the Nazis. On his way to the Gulag, he takes pleasure in allowing what he then perceives to be a lesser man than himself carry his heavy luggage. Reflecting upon his life, Solzhenitsyn writes, "It was granted me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back, which nearly broke beneath its load, this essential experience, how a human being becomes evil and how good. In the intoxication of youthful successes, I'd felt myself to be infallible. I was therefore cruel. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor. In my most evil moments, I was convinced that I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. And it was only when I lay there on the rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good." He says, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts." He says, "Inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of hearts, there remains an uprooted and unuprooted small corner of evil." Evil is often depicted as a fantastical fairy tale about some other people from some other time and some faraway land. By the way, that I just want to make clear, I've ended Solzhenitsyn's quote here. This is Kate Wand speaking. She says, "Evil is often depicted as a fantastical fairy tale about some other people from some other time in a faraway land, victimized by some external evil force, complete with cartoonish villains and heroes. Evil is grandiose and easily identifiable. It wears a specific face and has a life of its own. And it certainly doesn't require the collaboration of perfectly regular, seemingly good people. Nor could we ever be unenlightened enough to let such an occurrence repeat itself through us." She says, "By imagining evil as a great, dark, foreign specter with a life of its own, we move further away from our ability to understand it. And by dividing people into black and white categories, good versus evil, us versus them, we deny its true nature, which is part of our nature. Evil doesn't exist in a vacuum. And by dismissing evil as an enigma far removed, we shut down the capacity to see it in others. More importantly, we shut down the capacity to see it in ourselves. And if the potential for evil resides in all of us, what is it that triggers its expression? It's nothing extreme. In fact, it's the reverse. Evil is ordinary. Hannah Arendt wrote, "Good can be radical. Evil can never be radical. It can only be extreme, for it possesses neither depth nor any demonic dimension yet. And this is its horror. It can spread like a fungus over the surface of the earth and lay waste the entire world. Evil comes from a failure to think. It defies thought, for as soon as thought tries to engage itself with evil and examine its premises and principles from which it originates, it's frustrated because it finds nothing there. That is the banality of evil." End quote. Now, Kate Wand says, when people do not think, others can put thoughts in their heads. And if the greatest acts of evil are committed and accomplished by ordinary people who've lost their ability to think, this leaves a wide gap easily filled with propaganda. Again, Hannah Arendt says this effectiveness of this kind of propaganda demonstrates one of the chief characteristics of modern masses. They do not believe in anything visible, in the reality of their own existence, or their own experience, rather. They don't trust their eyes and ears, but only their imaginations, which may be caught by anything that is at once universal and consistent in itself. What convinces the masses are not facts, not even invented facts, but only the consistency of the system of which they are presumably part. In her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt explains the notion of the masses hypnotized by an enormous lie. Quote, "A mixture of gullibility and cynicism had been an outstanding characteristic of mob mentality before it became an everyday phenomenon of the masses. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing. think that everything was possible and nothing was true. She says mass propaganda discovered that its audience was ready at all times to believe the worst, no matter how absurd, and did not particularly object to being deceived because it held every statement to be a lie anyhow. Well, Kate Wand says, we are living a lie now, and we know it. The question is, will this one end differently? I mean, this is pretty profound in the implications here, right? You and I are thinking, well, I'm a decent person. I'm not out there causing any evil. I'm not even, openly supporting it. I'm just kind of hunkered down here waiting for this storm to blow over. But the bottom line is, we do have a role to play. We're going to talk more about that, just the other side of these messages.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Just want to give a very quick shout out here to lifesavingfood.com. Oh, yeah. Got a great deal going on for my listeners through Christmas Eve. Here it is. Lifesavingfood.com, of course, is a food storage supplier. They deal in ReadyWise food storage products, professionally packed and good for 25 years shelf life if you do your part. In other words, don't set them out in the sun. Don't leave it in the trunk of your car. Just keep it in a cool, dark place, and this stuff is good to go for 25 years. That's nice, because you're going to need that food at some point. Well, here's the deal. Whatever it is you're looking for, if you're looking for, to make a large food storage investment, if you're looking to just, fill in a few gaps in what you already have, if you're looking to give some gifts for Christmas, my listeners receive a 30% discount, free shipping, no sales tax, if they use the coupon code HYDE, HYDE, at checkout. Click on the link that I supply in my show notes. It's there at my website, thebryanhydeshow.com, lifesavingfood.com. Just want to give a couple quick follow-up thoughts on the commentary from Kate Wand and the article she had about the line dividing good and evil. One of the things that she talks about here is we wonder how far this current wave of evil that's taking place will ripple. And by the way, I assume you're listening to this program because you already have recognized that what is going on around us, this continuous restriction of people's natural rights, is wrong. And it doesn't matter whether it's being played out like it is in Australia right now, where people are being forcibly placed into quarantine camps, or like it's playing out in Germany and Austria right now, where essentially the unvaccinated are under house arrest, particularly in Austria. It could be something happening here in the United States where it's just, mask enforcement or otherwise, vaccine mandates. By the way, we do have some good news on this. The vaccine mandates being, shot down by 3 separate federal courts here. But the bottom line is how far this current wave of evil will go and how deep this modern totalitarianism may entrench itself may depend on how terrifyingly normal it remains in the eyes of ordinary people. She says may ordinary individuals muster enough courage and self-awareness to find the line of good and evil dividing our own hearts, naming and rejecting evil when we see it, but most of all, when we see it in ourselves. There's the key. That's it. Repudiating the delusion thrust upon us and demonstrating all its fallacies provides the masses with an alternate map, or an alternative map of reality, one that exchanges propaganda for truth. And if history lends prediction to the future, then our fate depends on the sum of our personal choices and moral conviction, and perhaps above all, our ability to think. Well, that's the very reason why programs like this one exist. It's to give us that edge, to inspire you to go ahead and be the odd person out if you have to be. And that doesn't mean you have to walk around, with a pair of cymbals, crashing them and asking everybody to look at me, I'm different. As a lot of people are finding out, you don't even have to do that. You'll still draw attention, and it's not the pleasant kind of attention. Anybody who has sneezed in public in the last year and a half, 2 years, already knows people are primed to believe, hey, you're trying to murder people. If you so much as cough or sneeze, they're sure that you're out there, just trying to infect others. Come on, we know better. Come on, man, as our brave and competent president would say, come on. No, somebody's got to be willing to draw that line. I don't want to say I'm proud to be one of those people, but I'm grateful that I've been one of those stubborn, stick in the mud holdouts on many of these issues, and not because it just proves I'm right and therefore I'm better than you, but it just seems like there's so much risk that comes along with some of the things that have been forced upon us here lately. I know I'm being a little bit vague, and I'm doing that deliberately because there is some very active censorship that takes place when a person speaks just a little too clearly. Another good sign that you have, looming totalitarianism. Not only are we not free to discuss certain things, but certain things will be actively suppressed, if you get my drift. Now, that idea that, knowing that difference between good and evil, or knowing where the line between good and evil stands, that's one of the big challenges. Once you figure out it runs right through my heart, you are on your way to becoming a truly good human being, or at least you're aware that, hey, I have the capacity to do evil. I recognize it, and I resolve not to give in to it. That's a good start. And you may say, well, I'm just one person. What difference does it make? Hey, if you can offer, in the words of Albert J. Nock, one improved unit to society, that unit being you, that's still a net gain. There's one better person in the world. I think the biggest trouble we get into is when we start to embrace the notion that not only am I a good person, but I am so good that I really have some kind of natural authority, or I should be looked at as someone who can tell other people what they need to do. In fact, I should be able to harness the power of the state to force people to do what I think is good because I'm just that good. It's pretty tough. And I see many of my dear friends on the political right who, stand for freedom. They get teary-eyed at the national anthem. They salute the flag. They recite the Pledge of Allegiance with pride in their hearts that I'm so grateful to live in a free nation. But they'll still turn around and support totalitarian things when it suits them. The consistency that we've got to develop in our hearts and in our minds is that we do not initiate force against people whose behavior is peaceful, even if we disagree with them. There are people who want to live and to be left alone and will leave others alone to choose their own path to happiness. And there are people who want to control others. I suspect you're probably in that first group. But at the same time, no matter how committed we are to that ideal, we still could be prey to temptation. Now, there's another aspect of human nature, and this is, when it comes to getting your mind around what's happening, this is one of the really difficult ones. And that is admitting when we are wrong. Why is it so hard to do that? I've got a great essay here from Ronald Bailey on what confirmation bias does to us individually and how it prevents us from learning what others may have to teach us. Yes, even people with whom you disagree. So when we come back from the break, I'm going to share with you an essay from Ronald Bailey about how leaving your pride at the door is actually a good thing. This is published in Reason.com. And I'm just going to give you a taste of this article here. He says, people who commit intentional murder, and only those people, should be executed. He says, that's a view I held for virtually all of my adult life. He says, I'm fully aware of the decades-long debate over the death penalty. I've made it my business over the years to read the many conflicting studies on the practice's efficacy, but I didn't care if executing convicted murderers has a deterrent effect or not. I supported capital punishment because I wanted to do justice. Ronald Bailey says, I'm by nature a peaceable man. I've not hit anyone in anger since my teenage years, but my conception of what is just is informed by what I would want to do to a person who, beyond any shadow of a doubt, willfully killed my wife, another family member, or a close friend, and that is inflict barbarous atonement for a barbaric act. He says one of the chief purposes of state-sanctioned execution has been to maintain social peace by forestalling blood feuds between people who would otherwise seek justice on their own. Okay, there's a good place for us to tap the brakes, and we will come back to this in just a few moments. But this is one, look, I've struggled with this too. How do you admit that you're wrong? Doesn't that sound like, well, now I can no longer be trusted on anything? Right? I've been proven to be wrong. If I say that, everybody's going to look at me like some dolt who doesn't have enough sense to come in out of the rain. Actually, it doesn't quite work that way. Some of the most trustworthy people you're going to meet are the people who can admit they were wrong and change their thinking when they encounter new truth. And we need to be that kind of person.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Sharing an article here from Ronald Bailey. This is from Reason.com. Why is it so hard to admit when you're wrong? And he's using a personal example, talking about how for most of his life he has been a supporter of the death penalty. And I think a lot of us may have walked this path. I was once a very staunch supporter of the death penalty. And you know what? In recent years, I have had to walk that back because of some things that have been pointed out to me that I did not understand before. Now, this doesn't make me a pro-crime individual, but it does mean that perhaps I wasn't looking at it from a more broad perspective. I'm not telling you, by the way, that you have to be against the death penalty, but trust me, this is going to be a bigger issue in the days ahead, particularly from my friends listening in the state of Utah. This is an issue that your state legislature is going to be taking up soon. And we will have Sharon Wright Weeks back on the program to talk about why it's time to repeal and replace the death penalty in Utah. So hopefully that's not too triggering, but let's go back to Ronald Bailey's article. Again, he says, look, I'm a peaceful man. I haven't hit anybody since my teenage years, but my conception of justice, he says, is that what I would want to do to a person who murdered my wife or a family member or a friend, which would basically be inflict barbarous atonement for a barbaric act. And he says, I wasn't alone in advocating death sentences for murderers. Gallup reports an average of 66% of Americans and a majority of parties favored the death penalty for convicted murderers during the first decade of this century. Now, interestingly enough, by last year, by 2020, that number had dropped to 55%. Gallup has been documenting a widening gap on the issue between Republicans and Democrats over the past 2 decades, with a rock-solid 80% of Republicans still favoring the death penalty, even as Democratic support has dropped to under 40%. So despite that recent shift in the numbers, any rancor over the widening partisan divide with respect to the death penalty has been relatively mild compared to the growing estrangement over such issues as guns, affirmative action, climate change, and vaccinations. Research shows Americans increasingly align their opinions on hot-button issues along partisan lines and that they're likely to stick with those positions once committed. So today, if you are a member of one of the 2 major American political parties, you are statistically likely to dislike and distrust members of the other party. And while your affection for your own party has not grown in recent years, your distaste for the other party has intensified. You distrust news sources preferred by the other side. Its supporters seem increasingly alien to you. Different, not just in partisan affiliation, but in social, cultural, economic, even racial characteristics. You may even consider them subhuman in some respects. But listen to this. He says you're also likely to be wrong about the characteristics of members of the other party, about what they actually believe, and even about their views of you. But you're trapped in a partisan prison with the psychological effects of confirmation bias. Being confronted with factual information that contradicts your previously held views does not change them, and it may even reinforce them. Vilification of the other party perversely leads partisans to behave in precisely the norm-violating and game-rigging ways that they fear their opponents will. It's a classic vicious cycle, he says, and it's accelerating. And it also tends to trap individuals within their pre-existing worldviews. Now, Ronald Bailey says, as a libertarian, conventional left-right partisan splits over many public policy issues are not particularly relevant to me. But even as my unease about the death penalty slowly mounted, I found in myself an incredibly powerful reluctance to publicly change my view and renounce prior commitments on the matter. Why is it so hard to admit you're wrong, especially in the realm of politics? He says social scientists have a term for the phenomenon described above. It's called affective polarization. So in the U.S. context, that would mean Democrats and Republicans' growing tendency to dislike and distrust each other. Since 1978, he writes, the Northwestern University psychologist Eli Finkel and his colleagues have been trying to capture this phenomenon with a thermometer. By asking Americans to describe their feelings on a scale from cold at 0 degrees to warm, 100 degrees. They found that people feel quite warmly about their co-partisans, consistently reporting a balmy 70 to 75 degrees. In contrast, feelings towards opposing partisans have plummeted from a mild 48 degrees in the 1970s to a frosty 20 degrees today, an emotional cold snap. Since 2012, and for the first time on record, out-party hate has been stronger than in-party love. They write in the October 30th issue 2020 of Science. Now, the consequences of this big chill are apparent in other studies, notably the work of Louisiana State University political scientist Nathan Calmo and University of Maryland political scientist Liliana Mason. One of their more striking results is that 60 to 70% of both parties in a 2017-2018 survey said they thought the other party was a serious threat to the United States and its people. 40% of its respondents in both parties thought the other party was downright evil. In another poll, 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats agreed with the brutal sentiment that the country would be better off if large numbers of opposing partisans in the public today just died. And 18% of Democrats and 13% of Republicans said that violence would be justified if the opposing party won the 2020 presidential election. Now, Ronald Bailey says such studies suggest there's something substantially different about the virulence of partisan sentiment in recent years, and that trend isn't going away. Why do Americans increasingly think ill of their political opponents? Well, to some extent, people may be taking their cues from the political elites. Parsing the roll call votes of Democratic and Republican legislators reveals steeply increasing partisan polarization in Congress since the 1970s. In a 2018 Electoral Studies article on how party elite polarization affects voters, the Texas Tech political scientist Kevin K. Banda and University of Massachusetts Lowell political science John Cluverius find that partisans respond to increasing levels of elite polarization by expressing higher levels of effective polarization. In other words, more negative evaluations of the opposing party relative to their own. Now, the Emory University political scientists Stephen Webster and Alan Abramowitz have been tracking the growing mutual dislike of Democratic and Republican partisans, and they've noted that the growing ideological distance between the Republican and Democratic Party elites may be contributing to broader political or partisan polarization, rather. In addition, partisan affiliation used to be much less correlated to other social and political divisions. Mason and the Louisiana State University political scientist Nicholas Davis have studied survey data that YouGov, Polymetrics, and the American National Election Studies collected between 1948 and 2012. In a 2015 working paper, the two scholars report, quote, the stronger and more strongly aligned our religious, racial, and partisan identities, the more neatly our parties correspond to our ideological identities. This increased ideological consistency corresponds to an increase in partisan bias and intolerance across the electorate, end quote. So even with the growing ideological split, partisans dramatically overestimate the substantive differences between members of the two parties. Now, there's quite a bit more to this article. This is a pretty lengthy essay. But if you want to understand, why do I feel the way I do towards those who are not on my side of of a particular issue? In his case, he talks about the death penalty. Maybe it's time to take a closer look at how confirmation bias is at work in your own life. And trust me, it is in all of our lives. I get it too. I thrill when I find an article, hey, that backs up what I've already said or what I believe. See? I try not to get too high on the dopamine release of having found somebody who agrees. But that doesn't mean it's going to be obvious to everybody else. So here are my 2 recommendations. You want to guard yourself against confirmation bias, guard yourself against that getting swole up with pride and I can't be wrong. It's sad when people go down that path where they get so puffed up and so full of themselves they just simply cannot be wrong. These are my recommendations. Number 1, focus on building your understanding. In other words, instead of insisting everybody else see what's plainly in front of them, make sure that you see plainly what's in front of you. That's the first recommendation. You have to be the one to do your own homework and own your own worldview. The fact that you're listening to this show tells me you're probably on that path already. Here's the second thing. When you have the opportunity to speak the truth, no matter the person or group that you're speaking that truth to, speak the truth with love. Plant seeds, let other people come to the truth at their own pace, and do not stop loving them for 1 second.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Just want to give a quick plug here for governyouриncome.com. What could that possibly mean? Govern your income. Well, a lot of folks who unfortunately have been let go from jobs or pushed out of jobs because of certain mandates that have come along, they've discovered that, wow, maybe my job wasn't as secure as I wanted. So if you've been looking for alternatives, if you have thought, I'd really like to work for myself, I'm just not sure how to go about getting started, maybe you should go to governyourincome.com and consider the opportunity that's laid out there. This is not for everybody. Not everybody would want to be a day trader in the current, let's try this again, the foreign currency exchange markets, the Forex markets. GovernYourIncome.com is a company that will train you, and I mean thoroughly train you, to be a day trader in the Forex markets. And you can make some very, very good money. Best of all, you can work from wherever you have an internet signal. Very great opportunity for the right person. Click on the link I provide in my show notes, and hopefully you'll be very pleasantly surprised to say, hey, this is exactly what I'm looking for. So I've mentioned now that, courts have been striking down the Biden vaccine mandates. 3 of them now, 3 court decisions that have come out. And now, curiously, we're starting to see a number of mega corporations backing quickly away because they're finding themselves not backed by the government, even though the president's saying, oh, go ahead, implement these anyway. Why is that going? Why are the mega corporations backing away and abandoning vax mandates? Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute has an excellent article on this. And this was written last week and published last week. So he says, this week's nationwide annihilation of Biden's federal contractor vaccine mandate at the hands of Georgia federal judge R. Stan Baker has resulted in a landslide retreat of cowardly mega corporations from their so confident bullying of American workers. Biden's illegal gamble, the nationwide federal contractor vaccine mandate, has, like his previous Medicare mandate and OSHA if you have 100 workers mandatory vax mandate, been ripped to shreds early on in the courts. Now, he says Biden's mandates have always been a bullying gamble, an admission that they knew they were engaging in illegal acts, but they would continue to use the not insignificant weapons of the executive branch to blast as much harm as possible until the court stepped in and noted the obvious: you can't do this. Cynics, and he says, and I sympathize, will say, well, the courts could have ruled either way, so don't get too excited. Well, that's the lesson of the past 2 years. There's nothing below us as we look down. It takes our breath away. We now understand that our civilization has been built on a pile of sand. And any determined entity could tunnel under us as we're distracted by the human necessities of providing for our families or living our finite lives as best as possible. Once you see that, he says, this horrible reality cannot be unseen. Now, previously, we viewed our rulers, from dog catcher to president, as malevolent, but for the most part at a distance. We never thought they would reach out with their gradually but steadily acquired iron fist and squeeze the oxygen from our lungs. Take a shot or starve. Now, the Hungarians in 1918 similarly were shocked that living somewhat silently among them were aliens who would activate themselves at the exact most fertile moment and literally upend their somnambulant state, imposing mandates on their society that included mobile gallows, a crude earlier form of the forced vax. Daniel McAdams says, with the welcome disintegration of this evil government decree via Judge Baker's ruling that the contractor mandate is illegal, one by one, the megacorporations also see their position as shifting to the untenable. So they're bailing out as fast as possible. Some 83,000 Florida healthcare workers no longer face being kicked to the street by U.S. government-sponsored terrorism. Until this week, dutifully enforced by the free market prostitutes in bed with the state. That's harsh, but he's right. Sorry, maybe there's a gentler way to say that, but I don't disagree with his characterization of what these mega corporations have been doing. As hero Alex Berenson has reported Thursday, mega corporations in the U.S. are suddenly looking under themselves, and they're finding that they are alone. No more government guns aimed at the powerless, at least for the time being. General Electric, 3M, Verizon, and Oracle have in the past few days hedged their bets and snuck out of bed with the U.S. government. No more vax requirements. Now, we're talking about a large group of people no longer bound by the brotherhood of the needle. And Daniel McAdams says, hey, we are winning this for now. We should pause to drink it in. But at the same time, he says, we must also look at what has rotted in our civilization that would allow such a force to upend us, to unleash this iron fist once hidden in a velvet glove. He says, life will never be the same knowing what these people have done to us. And they must never be allowed to forget it. That's pretty potent stuff. And I know for some people it's got to sound just a little bit radical. Well, look at you railing against these companies, but ask yourself, when in history have the people who've had to use force to try to impose something on other people been on the right side? I know someone will say, well, Brian, wasn't slavery done away with by force? No, actually, not always. Some people will point to the war between the states in America and say, well, it was force that brought an end to that. But that's not really what that war was about. Lincoln was much more concerned about compelling those disobedient states that broke away from the Union. He wanted them to stay under the control of the federal government. So he was using force to keep them under his control. And I agree with Lysander Spooner, who says, what happened there was, some slaves were freed, but a whole bunch of new slaves were created, slaves to a government that they did not want. So let's not lose sight of what was really at stake here. This is not defending slavery in any way. It's just pointing out that the court historians write the history books, so it's natural to understand that the way that history is portrayed in most of those books, particularly textbooks, is going to be favorable to whatever regime prevails. Whoever writes the checks, for the textbooks really is going to try to make sure that they're looking good. Or at least the people who write the books and collect those checks are going to make sure that the people in power are favorably portrayed in what they're saying. How did we get there? How did we get to the point that people are willing to make deals with government like this, to where corporations will do the dirty work that government reluctantly admits, okay, we don't have constitutional authority to do this, but we can get these employers to do it for us. I mean, how many lives have been upended? How many people have lost jobs? How many people have been threatened and felt the unnecessary stress because of this? There's an even more sinister aspect, and I guess I'll go there for a moment. How many people have gone ahead and taken the shot, received the jab against their will? Okay, my daughter's one of them. She wanted to continue her education in nursing. She's making serious progress on becoming a registered nurse, but that was a wall that they pushed her up against and said, you have to do this or else. And so reluctantly she did. And I'm not saying this to condemn people who've taken the vaccine, but as you see some of the stories starting to come out, particularly the one that really grabs me is, why are we seeing so many young people, as in like sports figures, collapsing and sometimes dying from heart problems? That we're assured in no way is that associated with the vaccine, and that in no way reflects, what the vast majority of people have experienced. But see, we're still learning what some of these side effects are. We're still learning what some of the consequences may be. Not to mention, if you really want to come back to just the basic baseline, what is government supposed to do? It's not supposed to force you to make medical decisions against your informed consent. So you may think, well, I'm just gonna hunker down here until this unpleasantness is blown over, and hopefully, the right side will win. You don't really have that option anymore. And people who choose to stand up for their personal autonomy and refuse to be bullied and pushed into things that they don't want to do, you're gonna pay a price. Okay, there is no way to avoid the pain of standing for something. You got to be willing to suffer for your beliefs. God bless the people who are willing to do so, for the example that they set and for the courage that they send out to the people around them who see that it can be done, even if it comes at a bit of a cost.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.